I sold my company for $11 million in pure cash. My husband looked at me across our kitchen island and said to tell my sister and my mother that I went completely bankrupt. He wanted to see how they would react when I had nothing left to give them. I did exactly what he asked. 1 week later, the very people who mocked my downfall walked blindly into the most devastating financial trap he had ever designed. My name is Maddie. I am 33 years old and I used to believe that blood meant loyalty. Last Friday night at an upscale Austin steakhouse shattered that illusion forever. The chandeliers cast a golden glow over our private booth as the waiter cleared our wagyu ribeyes. I took a deep breath, forced tears into my eyes, and delivered the lie we had carefully rehearsed. I told my family that my software startup had collapsed. I told them my investors pulled out, the servers were shut down, and I was drowning in insurmountable debt. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever realized that your family only loved you for what you could provide. The reaction around the table was instantaneous and chilling. My mother Brenda did not reach out to comfort me. She did not offer a shoulder to cry on. Instead, she visibly stiffened, reached for her expensive designer bag, resting on the seat between us, and physically pulled it closer to her own body, as if my sudden poverty was a contagious disease. She let out a long, disappointed sigh and adjusted her diamond earrings. She said that she always knew my little computer project was a massive mistake and that I should have just listened to her from the very beginning. She reminded everyone at the table that she had always warned me about playing businesswoman in a world I did not understand. Sitting across from me, my younger sister Vanessa simply swirled her martini. The corners of her mouth twitched upward in a poorly hidden smirk. She has never worked a real job in her entire life, fully funded by my parents and now by her husband. She leaned forward and said it was a shame, but maybe now I would finally have time to help her run errands for her upcoming luxury vacation to the Bahamas. She completely ignored the fact that I had supposedly just lost my entire livelihood. But the loudest and most aggressive reaction came from Vanessa's husband, Donovan. Donovan is 34 years old, a highly ambitious African-American real estate developer who wears custom suits and never misses a single opportunity to remind everyone how much money he manages. He laughed. It was a deep, booming laugh that caused heads to turn at the tables near us. He shook his head in absolute disbelief and leaned back against the tufted leather booth. Donovan looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. He announced to the table that he was closing a massive funding round for his new commercial development next week. He bragged that he was dealing with Vanguard Horizon, the biggest private equity fund in Texas, and that he simply could not afford to have broke energy anywhere near his orbit right now. He claimed that wealth is an aura, and my aura had just flatlined. I kept my head bowed, letting a single tear fall perfectly onto my lap. I played the broken, defeated woman they all so desperately wanted me to be. I apologized quietly for ruining the dinner mood. Donovan scoffed again. He snapped his fingers loudly to get the waiter's attention. When the waiter hurried over with the leather checkbook, Donovan pulled out his heavy metal platinum card and tossed it onto the table with a loud clatter. He told the waiter to put the entire meal on his tab. He looked directly into my eyes and said that he would cover my dinner this one time, but I needed to understand that charity does not build character. He told me I was going to have to figure out my own financial mess quickly, because he was not running a homeless shelter for failed entrepreneurs. My mother nodded in eager agreement. She patted Donovan's hand, praising him loudly for being such a strong, successful provider for her favorite daughter. She then looked at me and coldly suggested that perhaps my husband Declan and I should look into renting a smaller apartment in a cheaper part of town. She said we needed to move far away from their neighborhood so we would not bring down their property values with our inevitable foreclosure notices. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I just sat there breathing softly, letting them reveal the absolute worst versions of themselves. The humiliation they were trying to inflict on me felt entirely hollow because I knew the truth. They thought they were burying me under their wealth and social status. Under the heavy linen tablecloth entirely out of sight from my mother's judging eyes and Donovan's mocking grin, Declan rested his large, warm hand on my knee. He did not say a single word to defend me exactly as we had meticulously planned. Instead, his fingers tightened slightly around my leg. He tapped my knee 3 distinct times. It was our pre-arranged signal. The bait was perfectly set, and they had swallowed it whole. The very next morning, the brass knocker on my door echoed through the hallway. I looked out and saw Vanessa's spotless white Range Rover, parked diagonally across my driveway. I opened the door to find my younger sister standing on the porch, holding an iced matcha latte, wearing designer sunglasses that cost more than my first car. She pushed past me without waiting for an invitation. There was no hug. There was no concerned look asking how I was holding up after the devastating news I shared 12 hours earlier. Instead, she dropped her bag onto my kitchen counter and let out a dramatic sigh. She complained loudly that her morning was already ruined because her yoga instructor canceled last minute. I stood there in my robe watching her pace around. She finally took off her sunglasses and looked me up and down. She said I looked terrible and that financial stress causes premature aging. She advised me to book a massage before my bankruptcy made me look completely unpresentable to society. I simply stared at her. Vanessa pivoted smoothly to the real reason she had driven to my house at 8 in the morning. She leaned against the marble island and said since I was liquidating my assets anyway, she had a massive favor to ask. She crossed her arms and stated Donovan was furious because she accidentally maxed out 3 platinum credit cards on a recent shopping trip to Milan. She claimed she needed cash fast before Donovan checked the statements. She looked at me with a perfectly practiced pout and demanded that I sell her our grandmother's vintage emerald ring. My heart remained steady, but I made sure my voice trembled slightly when I replied. I reminded her the ring was valued at $50,000 and was the only meaningful piece of jewelry grandmother specifically left to me as a keepsake. Vanessa rolled her eyes so hard, I thought she might lose her balance in her designer heels. She let out a sharp, patronizing laugh that echoed off the kitchen walls. She told me to stop being dramatic and stubbornly sentimental. She said grandmother only left it to me because I was the plain sister who spent 7 agonizing years locked in a dark office, staring at computer screens while she was out building a social network for the family. Vanessa stated I wasted my 20s trying to build a software company that ended up being a spectacular failure. She claimed nobody cared about my 7 years of 80-hour work weeks, my lack of vacations, and missed family holidays because all I had to show for my pathetic grind was a giant pile of debt. She picked up her latte and took a slow sip. She then offered me exactly $5,000 for the ring. She smiled warmly and called it a generous family bailout. She said $5,000 would help me buy cheap groceries and pay for moving boxes while allowing the beautiful ring to stay in the family. She argued since I was about to be officially broke, I had absolutely no business wearing a $50,000 heirloom anyway. She said it would look completely ridiculous on a woman standing in an unemployment line. I looked down at my hands playing the part of the defeated older sister perfectly. I let a few seconds of heavy silence stretch between us, acting as though I was agonizing over the terrible decision. I quietly told her 5,000 was a tiny fraction of its actual worth, and I did not know if I could part with it so easily. Vanessa slammed her cup down on the counter. Her voice grew sharp and intensely demanding. She told me to stop being selfish and that family is always supposed to help family in times of crisis. She insisted she was actually doing me a massive favor by giving me cash on the spot, instead of making me walk into a shady pawn shop like a common criminal. I opened my mouth to protest again, but I did not have to speak. Firm footsteps echoed from the hallway. Declan walked into the kitchen wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, holding a sleek leather folder. He did not look angry or surprised by her cruel demands. He offered Vanessa a polite, polished smile that did not quite reach his cold eyes. He set the folder down on the kitchen island, right next to Vanessa's bag. He flipped it open to reveal a crisp, cleanly printed legal document. It was a pre-drafted bill of sale for the emerald ring. He looked at Vanessa and calmly stated, since she was so eager to keep the heirloom in the family, he had already taken the liberty of preparing the paperwork for her immediate signature. Vanessa stared at the document for a fraction of a second before her face broke into a greedy, triumphant smile. She did not pause to question why my husband had a legally binding contract prepared at 8 in the morning. She was entirely blinded by the thrilling prospect of securing a $50,000 asset for 10% of its value. Right outside the kitchen window, Donovan's custom matte black Mercedes blared its loud horn through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Donovan hated waiting for anyone. The engine revved aggressively, sending a clear message that his time was vastly more important than whatever trivial business his wife was handling. Vanessa rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath about how Donovan was running late for a highly important breakfast meeting with his newest investors. She reached into her designer tote bag and carelessly tossed a banded stack of crisp $100 bills onto my kitchen island. It was exactly $5,000. She then reached out and snatched the heavy gold pen that Declan held in his hand. Before she could press the ink to the paper, Declan placed his index finger gently over the signature line. He offered her a polite but firm warning. He told her that since this was a formal legal transfer of a highly appreciated family asset, she would be legally assuming all associated burdens of ownership. He specifically mentioned taking over the tax burden in a casual tone, making it sound like standard legal boilerplate that simply did not apply to someone of her financial status. Vanessa let out a sharp, exasperated breath. She told Declan to stop acting like a hotshot corporate lawyer and just let her sign the stupid paper so she could leave. She loudly claimed that she knew exactly how asset transfers worked because her husband managed millions of dollars in commercial real estate. She bragged that Donovan's elite team of accountants handled their taxes anyway, and a simple family jewelry sale was never going to trigger a complicated IRS investigation. She physically pushed Declan's hand out of the way. She leaned heavily over the marble counter and hastily scribbled her signature at the bottom of the page without bothering to read a single word of the fine print. I slowly slid the small velvet jewelry box across the smooth marble counter. Vanessa snatched it up instantly. She popped the lid open and her eyes gleamed brightly as the large emerald caught the morning sunlight. She immediately slipped it onto her finger, admiring how it looked against her fresh, expensive manicure. She did not say thank you. Instead, she looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile filled with fake pity. She told me to use the cash wisely and suggested I start buying generic brand groceries to stretch my tight budget. The car horn blared again outside, much louder and longer this time. Vanessa grabbed her iced matcha latte and strutted confidently out of my kitchen. She yelled over her shoulder that I should not expect an invitation to their upcoming summer yacht party because my depressing financial situation would simply bring the festive mood down. The front door clicked shut behind her. I stood perfectly still, listening to the heavy doors of the luxury SUV slam shut. The engine roared loudly as they sped recklessly out of my driveway, leaving black tire marks on the pavement. I looked down at the $5,000 sitting on my counter. It felt like dirty money, but it was exactly the solid proof we needed. I turned to look at Declan. He was carefully lifting the freshly signed contract, holding it up to the light, with a highly satisfied grin. He reached into his tailored suit pocket and pulled out a bright red pen. He drew a thick red circle around a dense paragraph buried near the bottom of the page. It was printed in an extremely microscopic font that Vanessa had completely ignored in her rush to steal from me. Declan tapped the circled text with his pen. He calmly explained that grandmother had never paid the luxury property taxes or the massive appreciation taxes on that emerald for the last 30 years. The ring had been sitting in a complicated legal gray area. By signing that specific legally binding document, Vanessa officially accepted full retroactive responsibility for every single cent of the accumulated capital gains tax. He stated that Vanessa had just legally bound herself to a massive tax debt of nearly $70,000 payable immediately to the government. Because Donovan was her legal spouse, his beloved real estate business accounts were now firmly placed in the direct crosshairs of a federal tax audit. We had just handed them a live financial grenade, and she happily pulled the pin. I watched the red ink dry on the paper. The heavy silence of the kitchen was a stark contrast to the chaotic energy Vanessa had just brought into our home. I let out a long breath and felt the carefully crafted tension drain from my shoulders. The facade of the heartbroken bankrupt sister melted away instantly. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt for what we had just done to her. Declan folded the signed contract neatly and placed it safely back into his leather folder. He placed his hand on the small of my back and guided me out of the kitchen down the hallway toward his private home office. His office was a soundproof sanctuary of dark mahogany and sleek steel. It was the nerve center of his highly successful operations as an advisor for corporate mergers and acquisitions. He closed the heavy oak door behind us and locked it with a loud, satisfying click. I walked over to the leather sofa and sat down, feeling entirely calm. My heart rate was steady and my mind was sharp. For the last 7 long years, my family had convinced themselves that I was a naive little girl playing on a computer. They truly believed I was drowning in server costs and desperate for venture capital handouts. They had absolutely no idea who I actually was. Declan walked over to the large biometric safe built directly into the wall behind his custom desk. He pressed his thumb firmly against the glass scanner. The heavy steel door popped open with a quiet mechanical hiss. He reached inside and pulled out a sleek titanium briefcase, setting it gently onto the center of his glass desk. He unlatched the dual security locks and opened the lid. Inside, sitting perfectly aligned in pristine manila folders, were the finalized closing documents for the permanent acquisition of my software company. The thick stack of papers bore the bold gold-embossed logo of Vanguard Horizon. It was the exact same massive private equity fund that my arrogant brother-in-law Donovan was currently desperately begging for an investment round. Donovan had spent the entire dinner bragging about how he was going to partner with Vanguard to fund his massive new commercial real estate empire in downtown Austin. What he did not know, and what my shallow mother and sister could never possibly comprehend, was that Vanguard Horizon had just fully acquired my medical supply chain software. They did not acquire my startup for worthless shares or risky future stock options. They bought my company for exactly $11 million in pure liquid cash. Declan slid the master bank statement across the smooth glass desk toward me. I looked at the incredible number printed clearly at the bottom of the page. $11 million. The money was already fully cleared and securely resting in a fortified private trust that Declan had meticulously established offshore. It was completely legally bulletproof and entirely untouchable by anyone, including the aggressive IRS agents, and certainly my greedy, entitled family members. I ran my fingers slowly over the raised ink of the Vanguard logo on the contract. I thought about my mother frantically pulling her designer bag away from me at the expensive steakhouse. I thought about Vanessa casually offering me absolute pennies for a priceless family heirloom while flaunting her fake wealth. We could have simply walked away and enjoyed our newly acquired wealth in total peaceful silence. We could have easily moved to a beautiful island and never spoken to them again. But Declan and I both knew that if we just vanished, my family would twist the narrative forever. They would tell everyone that I ran away because I was a pathetic failure. We needed to stay and expose their rot. Declan turned his attention to the large, frosted glass whiteboard taking up the entire right wall of his office. The board was covered in complex financial flowcharts tracking every single asset, liability, and active legal contract my family members currently possessed. He picked up a thick, black dry erase marker. He walked over to the section dedicated entirely to Donovan's flashy real estate development firm. He drew a slow, deliberate circle around the name of Donovan's primary corporate entity. He tapped the center of the circle twice with the tip of his marker, leaving a dark black dot right in the middle. He turned back to look at me with a cold, calculating smile that sent a thrill straight down my spine. He said, "Let us see how deep he digs his own grave." It did not take long for my mother to make her next move. Just 3 days after Vanessa walked away with my grandmother's emerald ring, Brenda sent a cold, rigid group text. It was a demand for a mandatory family meeting at her house that evening. We arrived at her sprawling Mediterranean-style villa right as the sun was setting. The grand circular driveway was already packed with my parents' luxury sedans and Donovan's obnoxious matte black Mercedes. Declan and I walked through the heavy double doors and found them all waiting in the formal living room. My mother was seated rigidly in her high-backed armchair pouring a large glass of red wine. Vanessa was mindlessly scrolling through her phone on the velvet sofa, while Donovan stood confidently by the massive stone fireplace swirling imported scotch. Brenda did not bother offering us a drink or gesture for us to sit. She placed her wine glass on the coffee table and folded her hands tightly in her lap. She adopted a deeply condescending expression of manufactured sympathy that made my stomach turn. She sighed loudly, claiming that the nasty rumors of my complete bankruptcy were already spreading through her exclusive country club social circles. She stated with absolute authority that she simply could not bear the public embarrassment of watching her eldest daughter go through a messy foreclosure process. According to her highly twisted logic, my devastating financial ruin was not a personal tragedy, but a direct, unacceptable threat to the family's pristine social reputation. She declared that drastic measures needed to be taken immediately before the bank drove up, and hammered an ugly neon foreclosure sign into my front lawn for all the wealthy neighbors to gossip about. That was the exact moment Donovan stepped forward into the center of the room. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch and smiled broadly like a shark smelling fresh blood in the water. He announced in his booming voice that because he was such a highly generous and deeply family-oriented man, he was willing to step in and save us from total humiliating ruin. He offered to buy our house entirely in cash, right then and there. I stared at him as he named a purchase price that was exactly 30% of what our beautiful home was actually worth. It was absolute pennies on the dollar. He arrogantly referred to his insulting offer as a fast cash bailout. He claimed our house desperately needed a massive structural renovation anyway, just to strip away the depressing broke energy of my spectacularly failed startup company. Brenda immediately chimed in, clapping her hands together. She praised Donovan loudly for his incredible selfless generosity and fiercely insisted that Declan and I should be dropping to our knees crying tears of absolute gratitude for his charity. I kept my expression blank. I looked directly at Donovan and asked him how exactly he planned to pay for an entire house in pure cash when he was currently aggressively soliciting venture capital investors just to keep his commercial projects afloat. Donovan laughed loudly, throwing his head back. He puffed out his broad chest and proudly declared that his massive new Series B funding round was completely and permanently locked in. He aggressively bragged that the massive private equity fund Vanguard Horizon was practically begging to throw millions of dollars at him because his architectural vision for downtown Austin was absolutely revolutionary. He arrogantly claimed his corporate business accounts were about to be flooded with so much liquid capital that buying my pathetic little suburban house was as cheap and meaningless to him as buying a morning cup of coffee. He paced back and forth in front of the roaring fireplace, boasting endlessly about his elite financial connections and how the brilliant minds at Vanguard personally recognized his unique entrepreneurial genius. Declan did not flinch. He let the heavy silence hang in the room for a long moment, allowing Donovan's arrogant laughter to bounce off the high ceilings. My mother and sister were practically glowing with twisted pride watching my husband get verbally humiliated. But Declan simply reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek silver pen. He looked directly at Donovan with an expression of pure, calm professionalism that completely neutralized the aggressive energy in the room. He told Donovan that he was absolutely right. He admitted that my startup had indeed failed spectacularly and that we were drowning in debt. He said we had no other options left and that selling the house for cash tonight was the only way to avoid the public humiliation of a bank foreclosure. My mother let out a loud gasp of dramatic relief. She pressed her hand against her chest and thanked God that we were finally listening to reason. Vanessa clapped her hands together excitedly, already talking about how she wanted to gut my beautiful kitchen and replace the custom marble countertops with something far more expensive and trendy. She was already planning her first dinner party in the home I had meticulously designed. But Donovan just smirked. He took another sip of his scotch and asked Declan how fast they could get the paperwork drawn up. He arrogantly stated that his legal team was extremely busy handling his massive Vanguard Horizon deal, but he supposed he could have his junior associates draft a simple residential purchase agreement by Monday morning. Declan shook his head politely. He reached down and opened his leather briefcase resting on the floor beside him. He explained that since time was of the essence and the bank was breathing down our necks, he had already taken the liberty of drafting the preliminary transfer documents. He pulled out a thick stack of legal papers and placed them gently onto the glass coffee table. He told Donovan that he wanted to make this transaction as seamless as possible for a busy real estate mogul like him. Donovan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. He asked what the catch was. Declan smiled warmly and assured him there was no catch at all. However, Declan explained that because Donovan was purchasing the property far below market value and paying in pure cash, they needed to structure the sale carefully to avoid triggering a massive gift tax from the IRS. Declan smoothly suggested they use a standard cross-collateralization agreement. He framed it entirely as a brilliant financial loophole. He told Donovan that by legally linking our small residential property directly to the corporate umbrella of his massive downtown commercial development, they could classify the purchase as a corporate asset expansion rather than a personal real estate transaction. Declan pointed to a specific clause on page 3, stating this would allow Donovan to legally write off the entire purchase price against his upcoming Series B funding capital. Declan played to Donovan's massive ego perfectly. He used complex corporate jargon but delivered it with a tone of subservient respect. He told Donovan that a high-level developer of his caliber surely understood the massive tax benefits of cross-collateralizing personal assets against commercial portfolios. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Donovan puffed out his chest, immediately taking the bait. He looked over at my mother and Vanessa with a deeply arrogant smile. He loudly proclaimed that cross-collateralization was his bread and butter. He bragged that he used those kinds of advanced corporate loopholes every single day to outsmart the federal government. He told Declan that it was about time the glorified corporate middleman learned a thing or two about real wealth-building strategies. He claimed his own lawyers were always too timid to execute aggressive maneuvers like this. Donovan set his scotch glass down on the mantel and walked over to the coffee table. He did not even bother to sit down. He snatched the silver pen from Declan's hand and hovered over the documents. For a brief second, a tiny sliver of panic flashed through my mind. If Donovan actually stopped to read the fine print, he would instantly see the fatal trap. He would see that by signing this specific agreement, he was legally binding his entire multi-million-dollar commercial project to my personal debts. If he defaulted on anything related to my house, his primary corporate assets would be fully exposed to total seizure. But Donovan was entirely blinded by his own ego. He was so desperate to flex his financial dominance and humiliate us in front of my family that he completely bypassed the details. He hastily scribbled his signature across all 4 signature lines, barely glancing at the dense legal paragraphs. He tossed the pen back onto the table and let out a victorious laugh. He told Declan to have the keys out of the house by the end of the month. My mother stood up and hugged Donovan tightly, calling him the absolute savior of the family reputation. Vanessa poured herself a glass of wine to celebrate their incredible real estate steal. I kept my head bowed, playing the role of the defeated sister. But beneath my quiet exterior, my heart was racing with pure adrenaline. Donovan thought he had just bought my house for pennies. He did not realize he had just handed my husband the legal keys to his entire commercial empire. Thanksgiving arrived 2 weeks after Donovan signed the cross-collateralization agreement. The holiday was hosted at my mother's sprawling estate. Normally, Thanksgiving involved a team of hired caterers, but this year, Brenda decided to make a specific exception. As soon as Declan and I walked through the mahogany front doors, my mother intercepted us. She did not hug me or wish me a happy holiday. She handed me a stained canvas apron. She looked me up and down, stating that since Donovan graciously allowed us to live rent-free, it was only fair that I earned my keep. She told me the caterers were canceled because family needs to step up during financial hardships. She ordered me into the kitchen to prepare the feast for 12 people while the family relaxed. I took the apron without a single word of protest. I tied it around my waist and walked into the industrial kitchen. For the next 5 hours, I stood over steaming pots and a hot oven. I basted the massive turkey, whipped the potatoes, and prepared the intricate side dishes my mother demanded. Through the swinging doors, I could clearly hear the booming voice of Donovan bragging about his Vanguard Horizon investment over the loud television. I could hear Vanessa laughing loudly and the sharp clinking of expensive crystal wine glasses. Declan tried to come into the kitchen to help me 3 separate times. Each time I gave him a sharp look and quietly told him to go back to the living room. I needed him to stay out there and listen to every single word Donovan said about his corporate accounts. I needed to know exactly how much fake confidence my arrogant brother-in-law was projecting to the rest of the extended family members who had arrived. By the time the dinner was finally ready, my feet were aching and my hands were burned from the hot oven racks. I carefully carried the heavy silver platters into the formal dining room, setting the food out perfectly on the long mahogany table. My mother rang a small crystal bell, and the family filed into the room, taking their assigned seats. Brenda sat at the head of the table, with Donovan sitting proudly at her right side. Vanessa sat next to him, wearing a new designer dress that she had likely purchased with the money she made from stealing my grandmother's emerald ring. I remained standing near the buffet table, acting as the silent hired help they all desperately wanted me to be. I quietly poured their wine and served their plates. Nobody thanked me. Instead, my mother complained that the gravy was slightly too cold, and Vanessa loudly mentioned that the stuffing lacked the rich flavor the professional caterers usually provided. I simply nodded and asked if anyone needed more water. The ultimate humiliation happened halfway through the main course. I was standing quietly in the corner of the dining room, waiting to clear their plates. Vanessa was talking animatedly about her upcoming luxury winter ski trip to Aspen. She reached out to grab her crystal wine glass, and her elbow suddenly jerked outward intentionally. Her heavy silver fork slid off the edge of the mahogany table and clattered loudly onto the hardwood floor. The entire room went completely silent. Vanessa stopped talking and looked down at the floor. Then she slowly turned her head and looked directly at me. A cruel, entitled smile spread across her perfectly made-up face. She did not reach down to pick it up herself, even though it was right by her foot. Instead, she leaned back in her expensive upholstered dining chair, crossed her arms and stared right at me. She coldly stated that she had dropped her fork and told me to get her a clean one immediately from the kitchen. She then pointed her freshly manicured finger down at the hardwood floor. She ordered me to get on my knees and pick up the dirty one before it stained the expensive rug. Declan immediately stood up from his chair, his jaw clenched tight and his hands curled into tight fists. He was ready to end the charade right then and there. But I caught his eye across the room and shook my head slightly, giving him a silent command to stay seated. I walked slowly across the dining room, feeling the heavy mocking stares of my entire family burning into my back. Every single relative watched eagerly to see if I would finally break down and cry. I did not. I bent down gracefully and picked up the silver fork from the rug. I stood back up perfectly straight. I looked Vanessa dead in the eye and calmly told her that her pathetic little mess was completely cleaned up. Vanessa's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She fully expected me to break down crying or instantly run out of the dining room in complete humiliation and shame. Instead, I walked straight back into the kitchen carrying the dirty silverware. Behind the swinging doors, I could hear my mother scolding Vanessa lightly, but not for humiliating me. She was simply worried I might drop food on her imported rug. The long rest of the formal dinner proceeded with the exact same suffocating tension. I served the desserts and poured the coffee while they all pretended I was completely invisible. Once the heavy plates were finally cleared, my mother coldly announced it was time for the men to take their expensive cigars out to the newly paved stone patio. I stood alone at the kitchen sink, scrubbing heavy roasting pans with blistering hot water. Through the large bay window, I had a perfect view of the sprawling backyard. Donovan was holding court on the stone patio. He had invited several of my mother's wealthy homeowners association neighbors over for imported cigars and top-shelf bourbon. Even from inside the kitchen I could hear his booming voice carrying over the manicured hedges. He puffed on his thick cigar and loudly declared his real estate development was going to redefine the Austin skyline. One neighbor asked how he planned to secure the capital in such a tough economic market. Donovan laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. He threw his arm around the neighbor's shoulder, proudly announcing he had Vanguard Horizon eating right out of his hand. He bragged that the private equity fund was practically begging him to take their money. He claimed the executives were deeply impressed by his visionary genius, and the wire transfer was an absolute guarantee. Declan stood quietly near the edge of the patio, watching Donovan blindly dig his own financial grave deeper with every single arrogant spoken word. The trap was finally closing around him. My hands were covered in soapy water when my phone began to buzz against the marble countertop. I wiped my hands quickly on my canvas apron and picked it up. The caller ID displayed a private New York number. A smooth, professional voice greeted me on the other end. It was Richard, the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Horizon. The unexpected call sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. He apologized for interrupting my holiday, but stated he had urgent corporate matters requiring my immediate attention. He formally congratulated me on the successful finalization of our corporate merger. He then told me, as a direct condition of the $11 million buyout, I was officially appointed to the Vanguard Executive Oversight Board. He explained my new elite position gave me direct voting power over their commercial lending division. I thanked Richard for the official welcome and asked him exactly what the urgent matter was. Richard explained his underwriting team was currently doing a final review on a massive Series B funding request for a commercial development in downtown Austin. He noted the primary applicant on the file was a man named Donovan. Richard casually mentioned he recognized the last name from my background check and wanted to ensure there was no conflict of interest before authorizing the massive capital release. He told me the senior risk assessors were already hesitant because Donovan's portfolio seemed highly over-leveraged, but they were willing to push the deal through if I personally vouched for my brother-in-law. The sheer delicious irony of the entire situation was absolutely intoxicating to me. Donovan was standing less than 50 feet away from my kitchen, arrogantly boasting to the entire neighborhood that he completely controlled the Vanguard Horizon board. Meanwhile, the powerful CEO of the very same company was securely holding Donovan's financial future in his hands, waiting patiently for my explicit permission to release the funds. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear and looked straight through the kitchen window. Donovan was blowing thick cigar smoke into the crisp evening air, pointing confidently at the sky as if he already owned the entire world. He took another sip of his bourbon and let out a booming, arrogant laugh. He looked completely invincible standing there bathing in his fake wealth. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute power shifting directly into my hands. It was the most empowering moment of my life. I spoke into the phone with a voice as cold as ice. I told Richard there was no conflict of interest because I had absolutely zero faith in Donovan's ability to manage that capital. I looked right at Donovan through the glass and gave the final order. I told the CEO of Vanguard Horizon to freeze his funding immediately. I lowered my phone and ended the call, The screen went black, reflecting my own cold smile. Outside, Donovan was still laughing, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just annihilated his entire financial future with a single sentence. I slipped my phone back into my apron pocket and picked up a stack of empty serving bowls. I pushed through the heavy swinging doors and headed straight for the walk-in pantry to put them away. The pantry was quiet, smelling faintly of dried herbs and expensive imported oils. I reached up to place the bowls on the top shelf when the heavy wooden door suddenly swung shut behind me. The lock clicked sharply. I turned around to see my mother Brenda standing blocking the exit. Her face was completely stripped of the fake polite smile she wore for her wealthy neighbors. Her eyes were hard and calculating. She crossed her arms over her silk blouse and glared at me. She did not ask how I was feeling or if I needed help. Instead, she immediately launched into a vicious attack on my husband. She told me I needed to file for divorce from Declan first thing Monday morning. She called him a pathetic dead weight who was dragging our entire family name through the mud. She claimed Declan was nothing but a cowardly middleman who lacked the ambition to protect me from bankruptcy. She said staying married to a man who let us lose our house to Donovan was an absolute disgrace. She stepped closer, pointing her manicured finger at my chest. She demanded I leave him and move into her guest house, where she could properly monitor my terrible life choices. I stood my ground, holding her gaze without blinking. I quietly told her that Declan and I were a team, and I would never leave him. My mother let out a sharp, cruel laugh. She reached into the pocket of her tailored slacks and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She forcefully shoved it into my hands. I unfolded it slowly. It was a formal legal waiver. It was a legally binding document, completely relinquishing my rights to any future inheritance from the family estate. My mother stated coldly that since I was bankrupt, she could not risk me draining the family fortune to pay off my corporate debts. She told me Vanessa and Donovan were the only ones responsible enough to inherit her wealth. She demanded I sign the paper right there to permanently cut myself out of the will. I looked down at the paper. It was completely absurd. I already had $11 million sitting safely in a private trust. Her inheritance was nothing to me but a tool for her to maintain control. I looked back up at her and flatly refused to sign it. I told her she could not force me to sign away my legal rights in a pantry. My mother's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure malice. She took another step forward, trapping me against the wooden shelves. She lowered her voice to a venomous whisper and told me I did not have a choice. She claimed that if I did not sign that paper tonight, she would personally ensure my financial reputation was permanently destroyed. She leaned in close and revealed her twisted backup plan. She reminded me of the student loans I took out over a decade ago for college tuition, the same loans she had heavily insisted on co-signing to maintain the illusion of being a supportive parent, even though I paid every cent back myself. She aggressively stated she still had all the original paperwork. She threatened to fabricate a detailed story, claiming I had committed financial fraud by forging her signature to secure those loans. She told me she had enough wealthy friends sitting on national bank boards to ensure the fabricated story became public record. She promised to trigger a massive federal credit investigation that would permanently blacklist me from securing a job or loan ever again. My own mother was standing in her luxury pantry, threatening to frame me for a federal crime simply to protect her social image. She smiled a terrible, triumphant smile, believing she had successfully backed me into an inescapable corner. She told me I was a failure who had absolutely no power left. She demanded I borrow a pen from the kitchen and sign the document immediately, or she would make the phone calls the very next morning. She stood there waiting for my tears. I looked at her, feeling nothing but cold detachment. I did not cry. I did not beg for mercy. I simply reached up with my right hand and casually adjusted the digital watch on my left wrist. My mother glared at me, waiting for a breakdown that was never going to come. I let my fingers rest on the sleek glass screen of my Apple Watch. With one small, deliberate tap, I stopped the hidden voice memo application running since the moment the pantry door clicked shut. I immediately saved the clear audio file directly to my secure offshore cloud server. Brenda noticed my prolonged silence and mistook it for total submission. She snatched the unsigned legal waiver out of my hand with an aggressive tug. She smoothed out the wrinkled paper against her silk blouse and shoved it back into her pocket. She told me I had exactly until Monday morning to rethink my stubbornness and sign the document. She warned me that if I did not comply, she would execute her fabricated student loan fraud story. She turned on her expensive heels and pushed the heavy wooden door open, marching back out into the dining room as if nothing had ever happened. I remained standing alone in the pantry for a few minutes. The scent of dried herbs was suddenly overpowered by the pure adrenaline rushing through my veins. My mother had explicitly threatened to ruin my life, using fabricated federal fraud charges. She had done it confidently and entirely on tape. In Texas, only one party needs to consent to a recording for it to be legally admissible. I was that consenting party. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and checked the secure cloud drive. The audio file was sitting there perfectly safe and untouchable. My mother genuinely thought she was holding a loaded gun to my head, but she had actually handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her social standing forever. I untied the stained canvas apron and tossed it onto a shelf. I pushed through the swinging doors and walked back out into the bustling party. The remainder of the Thanksgiving evening was a masterclass in psychological endurance. I watched Donovan continue to brag about his Vanguard Horizon deal, completely unaware his funding was permanently dead. I watched Vanessa flaunt her fake wealth, completely unaware of the massive capital gains tax liability currently ticking under her own name. And I watched my mother sip her expensive red wine, completely unaware she had just confessed to felony extortion on a digital audio recording. When it was finally time to leave the estate, Brenda stood by the mahogany front doors offering fake smiles to departing neighbors. When Declan and I walked past her, she did not look in our direction. She simply whispered quietly that I had better remember her strict Monday deadline. The crisp November air felt incredibly refreshing as we walked down the driveway toward our vehicle. Declan unlocked the doors, and we climbed into the quiet sanctuary of the leather seats. He started the engine and began driving away from the sprawling estate, leaving the toxicity behind us. The streetlights illuminated the dark suburban roads. Declan kept his eyes focused on the road and quietly asked me what happened in the kitchen pantry. He said he noticed my mother cornering me earlier, but trusted my silent signal to stay seated. I leaned back against the headrest and pulled my smartphone out of my pocket. I seamlessly synced my Bluetooth to the premium car audio system. I turned to Declan and told him my mother had just given us the greatest Thanksgiving gift I could have possibly asked for. I pressed play on the saved audio file. The heavy silence of the car interior was instantly broken by the sharp, venomous voice of my mother echoing loudly through the surround sound speakers. Declan listened intently as the digital recording played. He heard her aggressively demand that I file for divorce. He heard her try to ruthlessly force me to sign away my inheritance. He heard the vicious threat to fabricate a federal student loan fraud story to permanently destroy my financial reputation. The recording perfectly captured every cruel word and every detail of her extortion plan. When the audio file ended, the car was perfectly quiet again. Declan gripped the steering wheel tightly. A slow, calculating smile spread across his handsome face. He looked over at me and stated confidently she had just handed us ironclad proof of felony blackmail. He stated between Donovan's looming financial collapse, Vanessa's tax trap, and Brenda's recorded extortion, we finally had enough legal ammunition to completely obliterate their entire foundation. The damning evidence was fully secured. The bait was successfully taken. Now it was finally time to let them commit their last fatal mistake. The morning after Thanksgiving felt entirely different than any holiday morning before. While the rest of the country was fighting over discounted electronics at crowded shopping malls, Declan and I sat peacefully on our balcony drinking French press coffee. We watched the sunrise over the Austin skyline, knowing perfectly well that a financial hurricane was about to make landfall right on top of my sister's house. Across town, the illusion of Donovan's untouchable wealth was violently shattering into pieces. At exactly 9 in the morning, Vanguard Horizon sent the official notification. I knew the timeline because Richard had kindly CC'd my private Vanguard executive email on the corporate rejection letter. The email was cold, sterile, and completely uncompromising. It stated that upon final review of his heavily leveraged portfolio, Vanguard Horizon was officially permanently withdrawing their Series B funding offer. All negotiations were terminated effectively, immediately. There was no room for appeal. I could only imagine the pure, visceral panic that must have gripped Donovan's chest when he read those words on his phone screen. He had spent months aggressively bragging to every single person in his social circle that this massive capital injection was a guaranteed lock. He had already signed binding preliminary contracts with top-tier construction crews and architects, relying entirely on Vanguard's money to cover the initial massive deposits. Without those millions of dollars pouring in by Monday morning, his entire commercial real estate project was thrust into immediate catastrophic default. The domino effect would be brutal. His existing investors would panic and pull out. The banks would instantly call in his previous loans. His custom suits and matte black Mercedes would be repossessed before Christmas. According to the frantic voicemail Vanessa left on my phone later that afternoon, Donovan completely lost his mind. He locked himself inside his expensive home office and began tearing the room apart. He was sweating profusely, pulling out drawers, and frantically flipping through thick leather binders trying to find a magical financial loophole. He needed collateral immediately. He desperately needed to secure a massive high-interest bridge loan from a shadow lender just to keep the lights on until he could somehow secure another legitimate investor. But he had absolutely nothing left to leverage. His personal accounts were heavily drained to maintain his luxurious lifestyle, and his commercial assets were already leveraged to the absolute maximum limit. He paced back and forth across his expensive Persian rug, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking as he dialed his accountants and lawyers, but nobody answered their phones on a holiday weekend. He was completely isolated. He stared wildly at the financial charts on his computer monitor, watching his net worth plummet toward zero in real time. He needed a high-value asset that was flying completely under the radar, something he could quickly pledge as collateral without triggering a massive federal background check. That was the exact moment his desperate mind landed on me. He remembered my tears at the steakhouse. He remembered the story of my failed software company. But Donovan was a man who always looked for scraps he could steal from the weak. He suddenly remembered that 3 years ago, during a drunken family dinner, I had proudly announced securing an incredibly complex and highly valuable utility patent for my software's core algorithm. At the time, Donovan mocked me, calling it a worthless piece of digital paper. But now that digital paper was the only lifeboat in his sinking ocean. In his twisted, arrogant mind, my company was completely dead and liquidated. He assumed that because I was currently facing a fake bankruptcy, I had entirely abandoned my intellectual property rights. He figured I was far too broken and legally incompetent to ever track what happened to a dormant patent. He did not view it as stealing from his wife's sister. He viewed it as claiming an abandoned asset that I was simply too stupid to monetize. He rushed over to his mahogany filing cabinet and pulled out a stack of blank corporate asset transfer documents. His breathing slowed as a malicious plan formed in his mind. He knew exactly how much shadow lenders valued tech patents in the Austin market. If he could simply transfer the legal ownership of my software patent into his own corporate holding company, he could immediately pledge it as hard collateral for a $2 million emergency bridge loan. It would be enough cash to cover his immediate construction deposits and buy him 30 days of survival. He sat down at his desk and smoothed out the blank transfer forms. He grabbed his heavy gold pen. He was no longer an arrogant bully. He was a desperate drowning man willing to commit a massive federal crime just to keep his head above water. Donovan did not want to carry the weight of this massive risk entirely alone. He walked over to the heavy oak door of his home office and locked it firmly from the inside. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and texted his wife demanding she come downstairs immediately. Vanessa knocked lightly a few moments later, carrying a fresh mimosa, completely unaware that her luxurious life was currently hanging by a fragile thread. Donovan quickly unlocked the door, pulled her inside and locked it again. He did not tell her the complete truth about Vanguard Horizon. His ego was far too fragile to admit total defeat. Instead, he paced the floor and explained that the private equity firm was simply delaying the massive transfer due to some annoying bureaucratic red tape. He told Vanessa that he desperately needed a temporary bridge loan from a private lender to cover his immediate construction deposits and prevent a public relations disaster. Vanessa looked bored, taking a sip of her drink. She asked him why he was acting so paranoid if it was just a simple cash flow delay. Donovan stopped pacing and looked her directly in the eye. He explained that the private lenders required immediate high-value collateral to wire the funds today, and all of his current corporate assets were temporarily tied up in the Vanguard negotiations. He then walked over to his desk and pointed to the blank corporate asset transfer document sitting next to his heavy gold pen. Donovan explained his twisted plan. He told Vanessa about the highly complex utility patent I had secured for my software company years ago. He claimed that since my startup was bankrupt and liquidated, the patent was essentially an abandoned asset floating uselessly in the system. He aggressively justified his plan by stating that since they were generously letting me live in my house for a few extra weeks, it was only fair that they extracted some value from my past failures. He looked at Vanessa and told her that if they simply transferred the legal ownership of the patent to his holding company, he could immediately secure a $2 million loan and keep their luxurious lifestyle completely intact. Vanessa did not express a single ounce of moral hesitation. She did not express concern for her sister or worry about the legal ramifications of stealing intellectual property. Instead, her eyes lit up with greedy excitement. She set her mimosa down on the desk and laughed. She said it was absolutely brilliant and that I was far too financially incompetent to ever realize the patent was gone. She complained that I never deserved to hold such a valuable asset anyway, since I clearly lacked the ruthless business instincts required to succeed. Vanessa fully embraced the delusion that they were entirely entitled to take whatever they wanted from me. Donovan placed the transfer documents directly in front of her. He tapped the blank signature line at the bottom of the final page. He told her there was only one minor obstacle left. The private lender required a digital scan of the signed transfer agreement before they would authorize the immediate wire transfer. Donovan explained that because he was the recipient of the asset, it would look highly suspicious if his handwriting was on my signature line. He needed someone else to forge it to create a plausible layer of separation, just in case the private lender ever decided to verify the specific details of the transaction. Vanessa smiled a cruel, calculating smile. She proudly reminded Donovan that she used to forge my signature on her terrible report cards all throughout high school. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a canceled check I had written to her years ago. She placed the old check right next to the blank legal document. She picked up Donovan's heavy gold pen and practiced my signature 2 times on a scrap piece of paper. Her movements were smooth and completely unbothered. Without a single moment of hesitation, she leaned over the desk and perfectly forged my signature onto the official asset transfer document. Donovan let out a massive sigh of relief. He grabbed the freshly signed document and immediately placed it face down on his high-speed office scanner. He pressed the bright green button and watched as the machine quietly digitized the forged paperwork. He then sat down in his leather executive chair and opened his encrypted email portal. He attached the digital file containing my forged signature to a message addressed to the private shadow lender. Donovan confidently typed out a brief message requesting the $2 million wire transfer. He looked up at Vanessa, who was smiling brightly, holding her mimosa. Donovan reached out and firmly clicked the send button. The email vanished from his outbox. In that exact fraction of a second, Donovan and Vanessa officially committed federal wire fraud, carrying a maximum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Mid-December arrived, bringing a bitter chill to the Texas air. The $2 million shadow loan Donovan secured using my forged signature bought him exactly 3 weeks of artificial survival. He paid his immediate construction deposits and temporarily silenced his angry contractors, but the crushing weight of his high-interest debt was rapidly catching up to him again. His corporate bank accounts were hemorrhaging cash daily. Desperation makes arrogant men incredibly cruel. In his panicked search for more liquid capital, Donovan realized he had one more asset he could immediately exploit for cash. It was the very house Declan and I were currently living in, the same house he had legally bound to his failing commercial empire through the cross-collateralization agreement. He decided he could not wait until the end of the month for us to quietly leave. He needed to flip the property or rent it to a high-paying tech executive immediately. It was a bright Saturday morning, just 10 days before Christmas. Our upscale suburban neighborhood was alive with families hanging festive lights and placing expensive inflatable decorations on their perfectly manicured lawns. I was standing in my front yard, quietly sweeping the porch steps, when a rusted white sedan aggressively pulled into my driveway. A large man wearing a cheap suit and a highly aggressive scowl stepped out of the vehicle. He did not walk up the pathway like a normal visitor. He marched straight across the frost-covered grass, carrying a thick manila folder. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, who was a prominent member of my mother's homeowners association, stopped hanging her silver ornaments to watch the spectacle unfold. The large man stopped at the bottom of my porch steps and loudly demanded to know if I was Maddie. I gripped the wooden handle of my broom and calmly nodded. He did not politely hand me the folder. Instead, he aggressively slapped the thick stack of legal papers directly against my chest, forcing me to catch them before they hit the ground. He practically shouted his next words, ensuring his voice carried across the entire street. He announced that he was a legal process server, officially delivering a 7-day notice of eviction. He stated that the legal owner of the property, Donovan, had formally requested my immediate removal due to complete financial insolvency and failure to vacate. He loudly warned me that if my husband and I were not entirely moved out by next Saturday, the local sheriff's department would arrive to physically drag us out and throw our belongings onto the public sidewalk. The silence that followed his loud declaration was deafening. I could practically feel the burning stares of at least 3 different neighbors watching from their driveways. Mrs. Higgins pulled her phone out of her pocket, undoubtedly preparing to text my mother and the rest of the country club gossips about my humiliating public eviction. The process server stood there crossing his arms, expecting me to burst into tears or start screaming at him. He was clearly used to dealing with desperate, broken people. I looked down at the harsh legal notice stamped with bright red ink. The sheer cruelty of Donovan's actions was staggering. He was kicking his wife's sister out into the winter cold just days before Christmas, simply to squeeze a few extra dollars out of a house he practically stole. The heavy wooden front door creaked open behind me. Declan stepped out onto the porch, wearing a thick cashmere sweater, holding 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. He took one look at the aggressive process server and the bright red eviction notice in my hands and immediately understood the situation. He did not yell. He did not threaten the man with legal action. Declan simply walked down the steps, handed me a mug of coffee, and offered the process server a chillingly polite smile. He thanked the man for his prompt delivery services and told him he could leave our property now. The server looked slightly confused by our complete lack of emotional hysterics, but he simply grunted, turned around, and stomped back to his rusted sedan. As the car sped away down the quiet suburban street, Declan put his arm around my shoulders. He looked down at the 7-day eviction notice and let out a soft, dark laugh. He told me that Donovan was truly a spectacular fool. By serving us this official legal eviction notice, Donovan was formally establishing the timeline and precise legal parameters of his ownership over the residential property. He was legally cementing the very cross-collateralization trap Declan had set for him. Every single cruel move Donovan made to hurt us only tightened the legal noose around his own neck. We turned around and walked back inside our warm house, leaving the gossiping neighbors outside in the cold. We had exactly 7 days to pack our bags and prepare for the final devastating act of our play. The 7 days vanished in a blur of cardboard boxes and packing tape. By the time Saturday morning arrived, the Texas sky was a pale, freezing gray. Declan had rented the oldest, most beat-up moving truck he could find from a local gas station. Its rusted bumper and faded orange paint stood out like a massive sore thumb against the pristine, manicured lawns of our upscale neighborhood. We wanted the illusion of our absolute rock-bottom failure to look as authentic as humanly possible. We began carrying the heavy taped boxes down the driveway, our breath visible in the freezing morning air. We did not hire professional movers. We wanted my family to witness our physical struggle firsthand. It did not take long for the vultures to descend. Just as Declan was lifting our heavy mattress into the back of the rusted truck, a gleaming silver Lexus SUV pulled up to the curb. My mother Brenda stepped out wearing a thick white cashmere coat and pristine leather boots. She had clearly not come to lift a single box or offer a shred of maternal support. She walked across the frosty grass and positioned herself like a wealthy overseer inspecting a chain gang. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and immediately began hurling insults. She loudly announced to anyone listening that she was completely humiliated to share my last name. Brenda called me a spectacular failure. She pointed her manicured finger at the rusted moving truck and said it was the perfect metaphor for my entire pathetic life. She reminded me that my stubbornness and lack of business intelligence had finally led me to the exact miserable fate she always predicted. She coldly stated that this public embarrassment was my own fault for not signing away my inheritance rights when she generously gave me the chance in her pantry on Thanksgiving. She told me I was dead to her social circle and that she had already started telling her country club friends I was moving out of state, out of pure shame. I walked right past her carrying a heavy box of kitchen plates. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of defense. 10 minutes later, Vanessa's white Range Rover swerved into the driveway, aggressively blocking the path to the street. She hopped out wearing designer athletic wear and a massive faux fur jacket. She held her smartphone out at arm's length, immediately recording a live video for her social media followers. She did not even look at me. She panned the camera across the front of the house, ensuring the beat-up moving truck was clearly visible in the background. She smiled brightly into the lens and loudly declared to her digital audience that she was officially the new owner of the property. She bragged that she was about to start a massive luxury renovation to completely cleanse the pathetic loser energy that had infected the walls. Vanessa strutted up the driveway narrating her ridiculous interior design plans to her phone screen. She talked about tearing down the kitchen walls and importing Italian marble for the floors. She paused right next to where Declan was securing a load of furniture with heavy nylon ropes. She looked at his simple work clothes and sneered. She told him to make sure he did not scratch the hardwood floors on his way out because Donovan's contractors were coming on Monday and they needed a clean canvas. She then turned her phone camera directly onto my face, attempting to catch a pathetic emotional breakdown. She asked me in a sickly sweet voice how it felt to finally hand over a beautiful home to someone who actually knew how to maintain an elite lifestyle. I looked directly into her camera lens with an expression of pure, absolute calm. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or engage in a petty screaming match on the front lawn. I simply stepped around her, grabbed a heavy lamp from the porch, and carefully loaded it into the truck. Our complete silence was a weapon they did not know how to fight. Narcissists feed entirely on emotional reactions, and we were starving them to death. Brenda grew increasingly frustrated by my lack of tears. She raised her voice louder, calling me a cold, ungrateful daughter who deserved every single bit of this terrible misery. Declan walked down the metal ramp of the moving truck and dusted off his hands. He looked at Vanessa still posing for selfies in front of the frozen rose bushes, and then looked at my mother, whose face was turning red with unspent rage. He offered them both a polite nod that carried absolutely zero respect. He walked over to me and gently placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the cab of the rusted truck. We had successfully loaded the final box. The empty, echoing house was officially theirs to claim. Let them have the hollow victory of the front lawn drama. They had absolutely no idea that every selfie Vanessa took and every insult Brenda hurled was just another nail in their rapidly closing coffins. Declan opened the heavy metal door of the rusted cab for me. I stepped up into the torn vinyl seat. The interior smelled sharply of stale coffee and diesel exhaust. Declan climbed into the driver's side and turned the ignition. The old engine roared to life with a loud, unhealthy sputter, rattling the entire dashboard. Outside, the driveway had fully transformed into a grotesque holiday celebration. Donovan had just emerged from Vanessa's luxury SUV holding a silver tray of crystal champagne flutes filled with fresh mimosas. He wore a custom-tailored wool overcoat completely inappropriate for any kind of physical labor. He confidently walked over to my mother and handed her a glass. Donovan laughed loudly, intentionally projecting his booming voice so it would easily penetrate the thin glass of our truck windows. He raised his flute in a mocking toast to his newest real estate acquisition. He loudly called my beautiful house a total teardown project, but aggressively stated the prime land value was almost worth the massive headache of dealing with broke extended relatives. He pointed his finger directly at the cab of the truck and yelled toward Declan. He ordered my husband to make sure the gas tank was completely full before returning the cheap rental because he absolutely refused to reimburse any moving expenses for a failed businessman. My mother took a slow, elegant sip of her mimosa and nodded vigorously in agreement. She stepped closer to the edge of the frosty driveway, balancing perfectly in her designer leather boots. She shouted over the rumbling diesel engine, demanding my attention. She told me I was making a catastrophic mistake by shutting her out and refusing to speak. She claimed that if I had simply shown a tiny ounce of humility and apologized for my massive financial failures, she might have graciously allowed me to sleep in her cramped guest bedroom through the holiday season. She turned her head and loudly lamented to Mrs. Higgins, who was still shamelessly watching the entire spectacle from the manicured lawn next door. Brenda dramatically proclaimed that she had raised a terribly stubborn and deeply ungrateful daughter who would rather live in absolute squalor than admit total defeat to her own mother. Vanessa eagerly stepped up right next to my mother, holding her expensive smartphone high in the freezing air. She was actively live streaming our humiliating departure to her thousands of social media followers. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger at our rusted U-Haul truck and cheerfully told her audience that this was exactly what happens when you do not hustle hard enough in life. She took a delicate sip of her bright orange drink and mockingly waved goodbye at the windshield. She yelled out in a sickeningly sweet voice, asking if I needed her to quickly wire me $20 for a cheap fast food lunch since my corporate bank accounts were completely frozen by the government. Through all of this relentless verbal assault, I did not roll down the window. I did not turn my head to look at them. I sat perfectly straight in the torn passenger seat with my hands resting quietly and calmly in my lap. I stared directly through the cracked, dirty windshield focused entirely on the empty asphalt road ahead of us. My absolute silence was an impenetrable fortress. I could easily see from my peripheral vision that my complete lack of reaction was driving my mother absolutely insane. She desperately wanted me to scream at her. She wanted me to cry, break down, and beg for her financial mercy. She needed my emotional devastation to validate her own cruel choices. But I gave her absolutely nothing. My silence aggressively starved her of the toxic, dramatic fuel she constantly craved. Donovan stepped forward, clearly agitated that his grand display of immense wealth and masculine dominance was not yielding the desired emotional breakdown. He slapped the hood of our rented truck with his bare hand, leaving a large smudge on the rusted orange metal. He aggressively told Declan to get his garbage truck off the property immediately before he called the local police for illegal trespassing. He bragged one final time that his elite construction crews were arriving bright and early Monday morning to completely rip out the pathetic loser energy we had left behind in the walls. Declan shifted the heavy metal gear stick into drive. He did not aggressively rev the engine or peel out to make a dramatic exit. He simply took his foot off the heavy brake pedal. The massive truck slowly rolled forward, creeping down the driveway with a slow, agonizing deliberation. The giant tires crunched loudly over the frozen dead leaves at the end of the curb. We pulled out into the quiet suburban street, leaving my toxic family standing side by side on the concrete driveway holding their expensive crystal glasses. I watched them grow smaller and smaller in the cracked side mirror. They were laughing loudly and clinking their glasses together, celebrating their hollow victory. They genuinely believed they had just permanently discarded the weakest members of the family. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them. The heavy rusted tires of the U-Haul truck hummed loudly against the asphalt as we left the manicured borders of my mother's upscale suburban neighborhood. I watched the identical brick colonial houses fade away in the cracked side mirror. The suffocating atmosphere of forced perfection and toxic family politics lifted from my chest with every single mile we drove. Inside the noisy cab of the truck, Declan reached over and placed his warm hand over mine. The tension that had kept my spine completely rigid for the past 3 weeks finally began to dissolve. We did not need to pretend anymore. The desperate bankrupt act was officially over. We merged onto the main highway, heading straight for the gleaming glass and steel heart of downtown Austin. The transition from the quiet suburbs to the vibrant, sprawling financial district felt like crossing into an entirely different dimension. I rolled down the stiff manual window, letting the crisp winter air flood the cab. I took a deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in years. My family genuinely believed we were driving this rented metal box to a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of the city to live in absolute squalor. They were celebrating our supposed demise with expensive champagne while standing on a driveway that was legally rigged to explode in their faces. Declan navigated the bulky truck through the busy downtown streets, passing high-end boutiques and towering corporate headquarters. We finally turned down a private access road leading toward one of the most exclusive luxury residential towers in the entire state of Texas. The building was a massive monolith of dark glass and brushed steel piercing the winter sky. Declan steered the beat-up U-Haul down a steep concrete ramp toward the underground parking facility. We completely bypassed the main resident entrance and pulled up to a heavily fortified private VIP security gate. A uniformed security guard stepped out of the booth. He took one look at our hideous orange rental truck and frowned deeply, preparing to turn us away. But then Declan simply lowered his window and handed the guard a sleek black metal access card. The guard swiped the card, looked at his digital monitor, and his eyes widened in immediate shock. His entire demeanor shifted into extreme professional deference. He quickly handed the card back, addressed Declan politely by his last name, and pressed a button. The heavy steel barricade retracted instantly. We drove down into the private subterranean garage specifically reserved for the penthouse owners. Declan parked the massive, ugly truck in a designated oversized bay situated directly between a silver Ferrari and a custom-wrapped Porsche. The contrast was absolutely hilarious, but we did not care. We hopped out of the cab and walked across the polished epoxy floor toward a dedicated private elevator. There were no buttons to push. Declan simply scanned his fingerprint on a glowing biometric pad. The stainless steel doors slid open silently, and we stepped inside. The elevator shot upward with breathtaking speed, taking us directly to the top floor of the tower. When the doors opened again, we stepped directly into our new reality. The $4 million penthouse was an absolute masterpiece of modern architecture. The space featured massive 20-foot ceilings and wrap-around floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the entire Austin skyline. The late afternoon sun poured into the massive open-concept living room, reflecting off the imported Italian marble floors and the custom floating staircase. It was a fortress of silent, untouchable wealth. Declan walked over to the sprawling kitchen island, dropped the rental truck keys onto the pristine quartz counter, and turned to face me. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a heavy, matte black keycard. He gently placed it into the palm of my hand, closing my fingers around it. He smiled warmly and welcomed me to our actual new home. He then walked over to a massive built-in glass wine refrigerator, perfectly integrated into the dark oak cabinetry. He pulled out a rare vintage bottle of champagne that easily cost $500. He expertly popped the cork, filling the massive penthouse with a loud celebratory crack. He poured the bubbling golden liquid into 2 tall crystal flutes and handed one to me. The crystal felt heavy and cold against my skin. We walked over to the massive glass windows together. Far below us, the city of Austin was a busy network of tiny cars and glowing streetlights. I took a slow sip of the expensive champagne, letting the crisp, bright flavor wash over my tongue. I thought about Donovan desperately holding on to his forged patent documents, thinking he had outsmarted a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. I thought about Vanessa and my mother reveling in their cruel delusions of superiority. I turned to Declan, my heart completely steady, and my mind sharper than a razor blade. I looked out over the sprawling financial district where Vanguard Horizon controlled the corporate world. I took another sip of my champagne, smiled, and told my husband it is time to drop the guillotine. Exactly 1 week later, the heavy velvet curtains of the Austin social season finally opened for the most anticipated event of the year. The annual Winter Solstice Charity Gala was held in the massive grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive luxury hotel. It was a dazzling spectacle of extreme wealth, where the elite venture capitalists, real estate tycoons, and powerful politicians gathered to drink premium champagne and write massive tax-deductible checks. It was the exact room where reputations were permanently cemented or quietly destroyed. Donovan and Vanessa strutted past the velvet ropes looking like absolute royalty. However, their shimmering exterior hid a terrifying reality. They were currently standing on a crumbling foundation of massive fraud and crippling debt. Donovan had secretly maxed out his very last functioning platinum credit card just to purchase the $20,000 VIP access tickets. It was an incredibly reckless financial gamble, but it was his only remaining move. The high-interest shadow loan he secured using my forged patent was rapidly evaporating, and his contractors were threatening to walk off the job site. Donovan viewed this gala as his final desperate hunting ground. He needed to corner a wealthy angel investor tonight, or his entire commercial empire would collapse by Monday morning. Vanessa remained entirely oblivious to the catastrophic financial cliff they were currently hanging over. She glided across the ballroom floor wearing a stunning crimson silk gown that plunged down her back. She proudly displayed my grandmother's emerald ring on her finger, ensuring it caught the light of the massive crystal chandeliers. She paused at the entrance to pose for the eager press photographers, acting as if she personally owned the entire hotel. She grabbed a flute of imported champagne from a passing waiter and immediately began complaining to anyone who would listen about the exhausting process of renovating the house she had just forcefully evicted me from. She spun a pathetic story about having to personally scrub my miserable loser energy out of the hardwood floors. On the other side of the grand ballroom, my mother Brenda was aggressively working the crowd like a seasoned politician. She wore a heavy diamond necklace and held court near the lavish caviar station. She was eagerly networking with the powerful Homeowners Association board members and the wives of local bank presidents. I knew exactly what she was saying, because her predictable cruelty never changed. Brenda laughed loudly, throwing her head back as she told a group of wealthy socialites that her brilliant son-in-law Donovan was a true real estate visionary. She boldly bragged that he was currently finalizing a massive corporate partnership with Vanguard Horizon. When a polite neighbor asked about her other daughter, Brenda let out a highly dramatic sigh of fake pity. She placed her hand over her heart and shook her head sadly. She claimed that I had completely failed in business due to my own arrogant stubbornness. She told the group of influential women that I was currently living in a rented trailer on the dangerous outskirts of town because I refused to accept her generous charity. She used my fabricated misery as a dark backdrop to highlight Vanessa's supposed extraordinary success. Brenda was actively cementing her own social exile with every single lie she eagerly told. While Brenda happily spun her web of toxic lies, Donovan was slowly unraveling near the private VIP bar. He tugged nervously at the tight collar of his custom tuxedo. His forehead was slick with cold sweat despite the heavy air conditioning in the room. He repeatedly tried to confidently insert himself into private conversations with elite venture capitalists, but they smoothly brushed him aside. The Austin financial world is surprisingly small and highly interconnected. Whispers of his severe cash flow problems and unpaid contractors were already beginning to quietly circulate among the serious institutional investors. Donovan furiously checked his smartphone every 5 minutes. The shadow lender was already sending highly aggressive text messages demanding the first massive interest payment. He glared across the room at his wife, who was blindly laughing with her shallow friends, and then looked at his mother-in-law, who was proudly selling his fake billionaire image to the entire room. They were a pathetic trio entirely consumed by their own reflections. They had built an elaborate, fragile stage of lies and gathered all the most important people in the city to watch them perform. They had set the scene perfectly for their own public destruction. The ballroom was packed, the champagne was flowing, and the press cameras were flashing. Everything was exactly in place for the main event. The soft hum of the string quartet faded into silence as the heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed to a warm amber glow. A single brilliant white spotlight cut through the darkness of the grand ballroom, illuminating the main stage. The master of ceremonies, a highly respected local television anchor, stepped up to the silver microphone. The lively chatter of the Austin elite quickly quieted down as guests turned their attention toward the podium. Donovan pushed his way to the front of the crowd, dragging Vanessa by the hand. He wanted to make absolutely sure he was in the direct line of sight of any wealthy venture capitalists taking the stage. My mother positioned herself right behind them, holding her wine glass high, ready to applaud whoever was wealthy enough to buy her attention. The master of ceremonies welcomed the crowd and thanked the generous benefactors who made the Winter Solstice Charity Gala a massive success. He spoke elegantly about the millions of dollars raised for local community programs. He then paused, his voice echoing loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system. He announced that before they began the formal silent auction, he had a distinct honor to fulfill. He stated that the gala was primarily sponsored tonight by the most powerful private equity firm in Texas, Vanguard Horizon. At the mention of Vanguard, Donovan visibly puffed out his chest. He turned to the wealthy couple standing next to him and loudly whispered that he was currently in exclusive negotiations with them. He arrogantly adjusted his silk tie, completely ready to network with whoever Vanguard had sent. The master of ceremonies continued speaking. He explained that Vanguard Horizon had just completed a highly successful $11 million cash acquisition of a revolutionary medical supply chain software company. He praised the brilliant mind behind the startup, calling her a true visionary. He announced that Vanguard was so thoroughly impressed by her exceptional leadership that they had officially appointed her to their executive oversight board, giving her direct control over their commercial lending division. Furthermore, he declared that this incredible woman and her husband had personally written a massive check tonight, becoming the highest individual donors in the entire history of the gala. The ballroom erupted into polite, excited murmurs. The elite crowd eagerly craned their necks to see who this newly minted multi-million-dollar tech mogul could be. The master of ceremonies raised his hand, commanding silence once again. He dramatically gestured toward the top of the grand marble staircase that cascaded down into the center of the ballroom. He proudly asked the crowd to please welcome Vanguard Horizon's newest executive board member, Maddie, and her husband, Declan. The massive bright white spotlight instantly swung away from the stage and hit the top landing of the staircase. I stepped out from behind the velvet curtains into the blinding light. The collective gasp from the crowd was completely drowned out by the thunderous applause, but the sheer absolute terror on my family's faces was unmistakable. I was draped in a breathtaking custom-tailored haute couture gown made of deep emerald green silk that hugged my figure perfectly. Around my neck rested a genuine diamond collar that sparkled aggressively under the heavy spotlight. It was a piece of jewelry making my grandmother's ring look like cheap plastic. Declan stood right beside me looking like a lethal corporate assassin in a perfectly fitted bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. He offered me his arm, and I placed my hand gently on his sleeve. We began our slow, deliberate descent down the grand marble staircase. The press photographers rushed forward, their camera flashes exploding like lightning across the ballroom. I kept my head held high, projecting pure, absolute power. I looked directly down into the crowd and locked eyes with my family. Donovan looked as if all the blood had been instantly drained from his body. His jaw hung open in pure disbelief. His expensive smartphone slipped directly out of his trembling hand and crashed onto the polished ballroom floor, shattering the screen. He suddenly realized the terrifying truth. The woman who just took total control of Vanguard's commercial lending division was the exact same woman whose house he just forcefully evicted. Right beside him, Vanessa's perfectly manufactured smile had completely collapsed. She stared at my diamonds while subconsciously hiding the stolen emerald ring behind her back. My mother Brenda looked physically ill. The wine glass she was holding shook violently, spilling red wine all over her pristine white cashmere coat. The pathetic, broken daughter she had just spent the entire evening publicly mocking was currently walking down the stairs as the most powerful person in the room. We reached the bottom of the staircase and the crowd eagerly parted for us like the Red Sea. I did not look away from my mother's horrified face. The trap had officially snapped shut. Declan and I walked smoothly through the parted crowd of wealthy investors and elite socialites. We did not stop to shake hands or accept the eager congratulations echoing around us. We headed straight across the grand ballroom toward the heavy oak doors of the private VIP lounge. I knew my family would follow us immediately. They were predictable in their absolute greed. The moment the heavy wooden doors clicked shut, sealing us inside the soundproof room, the frantic scrambling began. Donovan, Vanessa, and my mother rushed inside immediately after us. Their faces were flushed with a chaotic mixture of sheer terror and desperate, greedy hope. The loud classical music from the main ballroom was instantly muffled, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the private lounge. My mother was the first one to break the quiet. She let out a high-pitched, incredibly nervous laugh and practically lunged across the expensive Persian rug toward me. She held her arms out wide, and her eyes immediately welled up with completely fabricated tears of joy. She cried out my name and loudly declared how incredibly proud she was of my massive success. She actually had the absolute audacity to claim that she knew my software company was a brilliant idea all along. She said she was simply playing tough love to push me. She reached out to grab my shoulders, ready to pull me into a suffocating hug of toxic maternal affection. I did not step backward. I simply raised my hand and pointed a single finger directly at her chest. My voice was dangerously quiet, but it cut through the room like a jagged razor blade. I told her not to touch me. I warned her that if she laid a single hand on my custom couture gown, I would personally have the gala security drag her out of the hotel by her pristine white cashmere coat. My mother froze instantly. Her arms dropped limply to her sides. Her lower lip trembled as she immediately switched to her classic manipulation tactic. She stammered out that we were blood relatives and that family always sticks together through thick and thin no matter what happens. Vanessa chimed in next, desperately trying to save herself. She forced a bright, sickeningly sweet smile and nervously adjusted her crimson silk dress. She stepped forward and aggressively tried to play the role of the loving, supportive sister. She laughed awkwardly and said I really pulled off the ultimate prank by pretending to be completely bankrupt. She claimed it was a hilarious psychological test of loyalty and assured me that they were all just playfully going along with my joke the entire time. She said she was so relieved the fake bankruptcy was over because she was already planning to help me decorate my new luxury penthouse. She stated that sisters always share their massive success. I looked directly down at my grandmother's emerald ring sparkling on her finger. I felt nothing but pure, absolute disgust. Donovan approached next. He was sweating so heavily that the tight collar of his custom tuxedo was completely soaked. He stepped around Vanessa and approached Declan holding his hands up in a pathetic gesture of fake surrender. He forced a booming laugh that sounded incredibly hollow and terrified. He called Declan his brother and loudly commended him on executing a brilliant corporate maneuver. Donovan desperately tried to pivot the conversation back to his rapidly failing real estate development. He arrogantly assumed he could simply charm his way out of the massive legal trap. He looked at me and said that since I was now running Vanguard's lending division, we could finally fast-track his Series B funding and keep the generational wealth entirely within the family. Declan simply stared at Donovan as if looking at a dead insect on his shoe. He did not smile and he did not shake Donovan's extended hand. Declan reached into the inner pocket of his midnight blue tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. The time for ridiculous games and fake polite smiles was officially over. I stepped past Donovan, ignoring his extended hand, and looked directly into my mother's horrified, trembling eyes. I told them that Real Family does not forge signatures to commit federal wire fraud. Real Family does not hand-deliver eviction notices just days before Christmas to steal a house. I stated coldly that I was not their family anymore. I was officially their financial executioner. I pointed toward the leather couches in the center of the lounge. I strictly told them to sit down and keep their mouths completely shut because I was going to dismantle their entire lives, piece by piece, right here tonight. The absolute panic in their eyes was the sweetest reward I could ask for. Declan tossed the thick manila envelope onto Vanessa's lap. She flinched as it hit her crimson gown. She looked down at the official federal seal stamped in bold black ink across the front of the folder. It was from the Internal Revenue Service. Declan kept his hands casually in his pockets and told her to open it. Vanessa's hands were trembling so violently she could barely tear the paper flap. When she pulled the documents out, her eyes scanned the top page and all color drained from her face. Declan spoke in a calm, measured voice, explaining the reality of her situation. He reminded her how eagerly she snatched grandmother's emerald ring for $5,000. Because she was too arrogant to read the legal transfer document she signed, she absorbed 30 years of unpaid property taxes and massive capital gains liabilities. Declan informed her that the IRS does not take kindly to sudden transfers of highly appreciated undocumented assets. The federal government had officially triggered a massive comprehensive audit of her entire financial history. Vanessa gasped, dropping the papers onto the floor. She looked at her husband for help, but Donovan was paralyzed by his own terror. Declan continued stating that because the tax liability was nearly $70,000 payable immediately, the IRS had already taken aggressive preemptive action. He told Vanessa that as of this afternoon, all her credit cards and bank accounts had been completely frozen by the federal government. She was completely locked out of her own fake wealth. Vanessa reached into her purse, pulling out her phone to check her banking app. A loud sob escaped her throat. The accounts were locked. She frantically tried pulling the ring off her finger, scratching her skin. She desperately offered to give the jewelry back to me, begging me to take it. I simply shook my head. I told her that federal tax fraud is not something you can undo with a hollow apology. With Vanessa sobbing uncontrollably, I turned my full attention to my mother. Brenda pressed herself into the sofa corner, clutching her ruined cashmere coat as if it could protect her from the consequences. She tried to muster a look of maternal authority, but her eyes were darting around the room like a trapped animal. She opened her mouth to speak, attempting to command me to stop this ridiculous spectacle. She aggressively stated that I was maliciously destroying the family over petty money and that she would never ever forgive me for being so incredibly vindictive and ungrateful after everything she had sacrificed. I did not argue with her twisted logic. I simply reached into my custom emerald silk clutch and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen a few times and maximized the volume. I looked at Brenda and told her that she did not need to worry about forgiving me because she was going to be far too busy begging her wealthy friends to forgive her. I pressed play. The crystal clear audio from my Apple Watch recording filled the silent VIP lounge. My mother's venomous voice echoed off the walls. Everyone in the room heard her aggressively demand that I file for divorce. They heard her ruthlessly try to force me to sign away my inheritance. And then the most damning part played loud and clear. They heard Brenda explicitly threaten to fabricate a massive federal student loan fraud story to permanently destroy my financial reputation if I did not submit to her demands. Brenda let out a sharp, horrified gasp and lunged forward, trying to snatch the phone out of my hand. Declan smoothly stepped in her way, forcing her back onto the couch without laying a single finger on her. I stopped the recording and slipped the phone safely back into my clutch. I looked down at the pathetic woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a worthless outsider. I told her that the audio file was currently backed up on 3 separate secure offshore servers. I leaned in close, ensuring she heard every single word I said next. I told Brenda that if she ever tried to contact me again, if she ever spoke my name to another human being, or if she ever even looked in my general direction, I would immediately email that recording to the president of her country club. I promised to send it to every member of her homeowners association and every wealthy socialite she had desperately tried to impress. I told her I would incinerate her social reputation and hand-deliver the digital evidence to the police department for felony extortion charges. I watched the last remaining shred of her arrogant pride completely vanish from her eyes. Her elite world was officially dead, and she knew it. I turned away from my mother, leaving her frozen in absolute shock. My eyes locked onto Donovan. He stood rigidly near the oak doors, frantically calculating his escape route. He had watched me effortlessly destroy his wife and his mother-in-law within minutes. His arrogant, booming voice had completely evaporated. He swallowed hard, raising his hands in a placating gesture, trying to separate himself from the women. He stammered that whatever petty family drama was happening between us had absolutely nothing to do with him. He claimed he was an innocent bystander who generously tried to help us out by buying our house. He offered to sign the property back to Declan immediately if we just let him walk out of the VIP lounge quietly. Declan let out a sharp, humorless laugh, making Donovan physically flinch. I took a slow step toward my brother-in-law, completely invading his personal space. I looked up into his terrified eyes and told him he was not going anywhere. I asked him if he honestly thought I was completely unaware of what he did in his home office the day after Thanksgiving. I watched the blood drain entirely from his face. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I leaned in and calmly stated the exact name of the shadow lending firm he had contacted and the precise amount of the $2 million bridge loan he illegally secured. Donovan began to shake uncontrollably. He backed away from me until his shoulders hit the heavy oak door. He frantically tried to justify his actions, claiming it was only a temporary financial maneuver. He aggressively whispered that the software patent was sitting there completely useless since my company was bankrupt. He argued he was going to pay the private lender back anyway, so nobody was actually getting hurt. He begged me to keep it in the family and promised to give me a cut of the loan money to keep quiet. He genuinely thought he had simply forged his broke sister-in-law's signature to borrow a discarded asset. I smiled at him with pure ice in my veins, explaining the fatal flaw in his arrogant logic. I reminded him of the announcement the master of ceremonies had just made on the grand stage. Vanguard Horizon acquired my entire company for $11 million in pure cash. I told Donovan that when he and Vanessa forged my signature on those corporate transfer documents, he was not stealing a worthless digital file from a failed startup. He actively attempted to steal highly classified intellectual property directly from the portfolio of a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund. I watched his eyes widen in sheer horror as the reality of his actions finally crushed him. I told him he had committed federal wire fraud against one of the most powerful financial institutions in the country. Donovan dropped to his knees. The expensive fabric of his custom tuxedo pants tore against the Persian rug, but he did not notice. He clasped his hands together, pleading with Declan to use his corporate connections to quietly sweep the forged documents under the rug. He cried that if Vanguard found out, they would destroy his business and send him to federal prison. Declan walked over and looked down at the pathetic man kneeling on the floor. He reminded Donovan of the arrogant way he had mocked him in my mother's living room. Donovan had eagerly signed the residential purchase agreement without reading a single page, just to prove his masculine financial dominance. Declan calmly explained the beautiful reality of the cross-collateralization clause Donovan blindly agreed to. By legally linking his multi-million-dollar commercial project to my personal assets, Donovan completely exposed his entire corporate empire to our direct control. Declan reached into his jacket, pulling out a formal notice of corporate seizure. He explained that because Donovan committed federal fraud and triggered massive legal liabilities, Vanguard Horizon was aggressively seeking absolute financial restitution. Through the cross-collateralization trap, we had the legal authority to seize Donovan's primary commercial assets to cover the damages. I looked down at Donovan and delivered the final devastating blow. I told him that I now legally owned 100% of his downtown real estate development. The land, the unfinished buildings, the heavy equipment, and the corporate bank accounts all belonged to me. Every single contractor he had hired, every permit he had secured, and every cent of capital he had desperately tried to hustle now belonged directly to Vanguard, and by extension, directly to me. His fake billionaire facade was completely eradicated. He was utterly and permanently wiped out. The VIP lounge fell into a heavy, suffocating silence following my declaration. Donovan was still kneeling on the expensive Persian rug, staring blankly at the floor, as if his brain had completely short-circuited. He was a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had proudly thrown his platinum card at a waiter just a few short weeks ago. Before my mother could even attempt to formulate another pathetic excuse for him, heavy footsteps echoed just outside the private room. The thick oak doors swung open with massive force, completely interrupting the suffocating tension. It was not the hotel manager or the event security staff entering to check on us. Two men dressed in sharp dark suits stepped into the room, followed immediately by three men wearing tactical windbreakers, bearing the bright yellow letters of the FBI. The Vanguard Horizon corporate legal team had officially arrived, accompanied by highly trained federal law enforcement officers. The lead federal agent stepped forward, bypassing my frozen mother and terrified sister. He walked directly up to Donovan, who was still shaking uncontrollably on the floor. The agent asked him to confirm his identity, but Donovan could not even speak. He just nodded his head weakly. The agent immediately instructed him to stand up and place his hands securely behind his back. He recited the Miranda rights in a sharp professional tone, echoing loudly off the walls of the VIP lounge. The agent explicitly stated that Donovan was being placed under federal arrest for wire fraud, criminal forgery, and the attempted theft of highly classified corporate intellectual property. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around Donovan's wrists sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Donovan did not fight back or yell. His legs gave out completely, and the two federal agents had to physically drag him to his feet, holding him up by his custom tuxedo jacket. They marched Donovan out of the VIP lounge and directly into the massive grand ballroom. The master of ceremonies had just finished a speech, and the elite crowd was mingling near the silent auction tables. When the guests saw the federal agents dragging the supposed real estate visionary across the polished marble floor, the entire gala came to a dead halt. The elegant string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The silence in the massive ballroom was deafening, punctuated only by the aggressive clicking of press cameras capturing every single humiliating second of Donovan's absolute downfall. The wealthy venture capitalists he had desperately tried to impress tonight simply stepped back, pulling their wives away as if he were carrying a deadly disease. The fake billionaire facade was completely shattered in front of the entire Austin financial elite. There was absolutely nowhere for him to hide from the massive public shame. Declan and I followed smoothly behind the federal procession, walking calmly through the parted sea of shocked socialites. We stepped out of the grand ballroom and headed straight toward the expansive hotel lobby, where the valet staff was already waiting. Vanessa sprinted after us, her crimson silk gown trailing wildly behind her. She pushed past a group of wealthy donors and threw herself in front of us right near the revolving glass doors. She was sobbing hysterically, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She reached out desperately, trying to grab my arm, but Declan quickly stepped between us, blocking her path. She screamed my name, begging me to call the lawyers off. She pleaded that they were going to lose their luxury house, their luxury cars, and everything they had ever owned. She cried that Donovan was going to spend decades in a federal prison and she would be left with absolutely nothing. I looked at her desperately sobbing in the middle of the crowded luxury hotel lobby. This was the exact same woman who had laughed at me while forging my signature to steal my property. This was the woman who had happily handed me an eviction notice right before Christmas. I looked her dead in the eye and felt absolutely zero pity. I told her that she was finally getting exactly what she earned. I stepped past her, completely ignoring her loud, agonizing screams. Our chauffeured black Maybach pulled up seamlessly to the valet curb. The driver quickly opened the heavy rear door for me. I slid into the leather seat, and Declan climbed in right beside me. Vanessa ran up to the side of the car, slamming her bare hands against the expensive tinted glass, begging me one last time to save her. I simply pressed the silver button on the armrest. The thick bulletproof window rolled up smoothly, shutting out her screams and sealing her inside the magnificent nightmare she had built entirely for herself. The Maybach pulled away smoothly from the crowded valet curb, leaving Vanessa completely stranded in her ruined crimson dress. Inside the cabin, it was perfectly silent. I poured a fresh glass of sparkling water from the built-in mini fridge and took a long, refreshing sip. Declan checked his secure smartphone, confirming the Vanguard corporate legal team had already filed the formal commercial seizure documents with the state. The massive dominoes we had so carefully set up were falling exactly as planned, and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do to stop them. By Monday morning, the local Austin business journals ran the explosive story on their front pages. The digital headlines were completely ruthless, detailing the massive federal indictment of a prominent local real estate developer for wire fraud and attempted intellectual property theft from a major private equity firm. Donovan was denied bail due to the overwhelming digital evidence and the high flight risk associated with his catastrophic debts. He went from drinking vintage scotch in a custom tuxedo to sitting in a federal holding cell, wearing a standard-issue uniform over a single weekend. His entire fake billionaire empire had vanished like a puff of cheap cigar smoke. The social fallout for my mother was incredibly fast and absolutely brutal. Brenda had spent her entire adult life carefully curating an image of untouchable suburban perfection. But high society is a completely ruthless ecosystem that punishes failure severely. The moment the massive scandal broke, her wealthy friends dropped her like a highly toxic asset. She arrived at her exclusive country club for her regular Tuesday morning tennis match only to find her membership keycard suddenly deactivated at the iron front gate. The club manager politely but firmly informed her that the board of directors had held an emergency vote and decided her continued presence was a severe detriment to their elite reputation. The public humiliation did not stop there. Later that same week, Brenda was summoned to a mandatory emergency meeting of her beloved homeowners association. The very same neighbors she had arrogantly bragged to on Thanksgiving now sat around a large mahogany table, refusing to even make eye contact with her. Mrs. Higgins, the woman who had eagerly watched my fake eviction from her frosty lawn, handed my mother a pre-written letter of immediate resignation. They forced her to step down from her position as board president and completely removed her from the charity planning committee. Brenda tried to aggressively leverage her past financial donations, but they simply asked her to leave the room. She was entirely exiled from the only world she ever cared about. While my mother was rapidly losing her precious social status, Vanessa was losing her absolute grip on reality. With Donovan sitting in a federal jail cell and the IRS aggressive audit fully freezing their joint accounts, she was left completely destitute overnight. Her platinum credit cards shockingly declined at the premium grocery store, forcing her to abandon a full cart of expensive organic food, while the teenage cashier stared at her in pity. The ultimate stroke of poetic justice arrived exactly 2 weeks before Christmas. A legal process server aggressively knocked on the grand double doors of Vanessa's massive luxury estate. It was the exact same large angry man who had delivered my fake eviction notice just a few weeks prior. Because Declan and I now legally controlled Donovan's entire commercial portfolio through the brilliant cross-collateralization agreement, we officially absorbed the massive debts he owed to his primary construction lenders. The bank initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on Vanessa's primary residence to recoup their massive losses. She was handed a formal legal notice, giving her exactly 10 days to completely vacate the property. She had callously told me she was going to renovate the loser energy out of my home, but now she was the one being unceremoniously thrown out onto the freezing street. My phone began to ring constantly. Vanessa left dozens of frantic voicemails every single day. At first, her messages were incredibly angry and deeply entitled. She screamed into the phone, demanding I call the Vanguard corporate lawyers and fix the massive misunderstanding immediately. She ordered me to wire her $50,000 right now to hire a top-tier criminal defense attorney for Donovan. When I completely ignored those aggressive demands, her tone shifted to desperate, absolute panic. The voicemails quickly devolved into pathetic, uncontrollable sobbing. She begged me to remember that we were blood sisters. She claimed she had absolutely nowhere to go and that our mother flatly refused to let her move into the guest house because she was far too embarrassed by the massive public scandal. Vanessa begged me to let her sleep on the leather couch in my new luxury penthouse. She promised she would clean the marble floors and do my laundry if I just gave her a second chance. I sat in my spacious living room, looking out over the beautiful glowing city skyline, listening to her desperate pleas. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I simply pressed the delete button, clearing my digital inbox completely. I had told them I was not their family anymore, and I meant every single word. Exactly 1 year later, the intense summer heat returned to the Texas Hill Country. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my executive corner office, looking out over the thriving Austin business district. The view was spectacular, but the absolute silence in my life was even better. The chaotic screaming, the constant emotional manipulation, and the desperate financial hustling were entirely gone. My life was finally my own. I turned away from the glass and walked over to my custom mahogany desk. I was officially the Senior Director of Commercial Acquisitions at Vanguard Horizon, and my days were filled with highly productive meetings and brilliant corporate strategies. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. My executive assistant, Chloe, stepped into the spacious office carrying a sleek silver tray containing my afternoon espresso and the daily incoming mail. She set the tray gently onto the edge of my desk and offered a warm, professional smile. She handed me the important corporate briefs first, and then pointed to a small stack of crumpled, slightly dirty envelopes resting near the espresso cup. Chloe looked at me with a knowing expression. She stated that another batch of personal letters had arrived from the local Austin processing center. She asked if I wanted her to quietly dispose of them like she did the previous week. I reached out and picked up the small stack of envelopes. The cheap paper felt rough against my fingers. The return addresses were written in highly familiar handwriting. 2 of the letters were from a low-income apartment complex on the far eastern edge of the city. The handwriting was frantic and messy, instantly recognizable as Vanessa's. The other 3 letters were from a modest suburban rental property outside the city limits, written in the rigid, overly formal cursive of my mother Brenda. It had been 12 entire months since the charity gala, but their predictable psychological patterns never changed. They were currently executing the classic narcissistic hoovering technique. They were entirely cut off from my massive wealth, so they resorted to desperate written begging. Even though I never opened a single envelope, I knew exactly what words were violently scribbled on the pages inside. They were undoubtedly weaving elaborate, pathetic tales of their absolute misery. Vanessa was probably crying about her terrible minimum wage retail job and begging for just a few $1,000s to get back on her feet. Brenda was surely writing highly manipulative essays about the sacred bond of family and how it was my moral obligation to rescue her from social obscurity. They were desperately trying to suck me back into their toxic void, hoping that a year of total silence had softened my resolve. They thought time would make me forget the incredible cruelty they inflicted upon me. I held the stack of envelopes in my hand for a brief moment, feeling absolutely nothing but cold indifference. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I simply felt entirely free. I walked across the plush carpet of my office toward a heavy-duty cross-cut paper shredder sitting discreetly in the corner. I did not bother to tear open a single flap. I did not read a single desperate word. I simply dropped the entire stack of letters directly into the feeding slot. The machine roared to life with a loud, satisfying mechanical grind. I watched the names of my mother and sister get instantly chewed into thousands of tiny, unrecognizable paper shreds. It took less than 5 seconds to completely destroy their pathetic attempts at manipulation. I turned my back on the machine and walked back to my desk to drink my espresso. The heavy glass door of my office swung open again, and Declan walked in holding a thick leather binder. He wore a sharp charcoal suit and a bright, confident smile. He walked over and kissed my cheek before dropping the binder onto my desk. It was not a Vanguard Horizon corporate file. It was the finalized legal paperwork for our brand new philanthropic endeavor. Over the past year, Declan and I had taken a massive portion of the Vanguard buyout money and established a heavily funded private foundation. We dedicated our vast resources specifically to helping victims of financial family abuse. We hired elite legal teams, aggressive forensic accountants, and dedicated trauma counselors. We actively provided immediate funding and ironclad legal protection to individuals who were being financially extorted, manipulated, or trapped by their own toxic family members. We gave people the exact same tools and power that Declan and I used to completely dismantle Donovan's fraudulent empire. We were actively helping victims secure their hidden assets, break terrible legal chains, and completely rebuild their lives far away from their abusers. I opened the leather binder and signed my name on the final line of the foundation charter. I looked up at Declan and smiled. We had taken the absolute worst experience of our lives and transformed it into an unstoppable weapon for good. Donovan was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary, serving a lengthy 10-year sentence. Vanessa and Brenda were trapped in the miserable poverty they had aggressively tried to force onto me. They were completely erased from my world. I closed the heavy leather binder and looked out the massive window at the bright Texas sky, completely ready to begin the next chapter of my life. I placed the signed foundation charter back into the center drawer of my custom mahogany desk and locked it with a sharp metallic click. Declan held his arm out for me. I took it and we walked out of the expansive corner office together. The Vanguard Horizon executive floor was a hive of quiet, focused energy. Junior analysts and senior partners alike nodded respectfully as we passed their glass-walled conference rooms. Nobody looked at me with fake pity or whispered malicious lies about my financial status behind my back. The absolute respect I commanded here was entirely earned through late nights, endless coding, and sheer willpower. It was a staggering difference from the suffocating, toxic environment of my mother's country club, where respect was merely an illusion purchased with someone else's money. We stepped into the private elevator, and the stainless steel doors slid shut, leaving the corporate hum completely behind us. As the elevator rapidly descended toward the ground floor lobby, I leaned my head against Declan's shoulder. The subtle scent of his expensive cologne instantly grounded me. For 30 years, I had been fundamentally conditioned to believe that biology dictated loyalty. Society constantly drills the dangerous narrative that family is an unbreakable sacred bond, requiring infinite forgiveness, no matter how deep the knife is twisted into your back. Brenda and Vanessa heavily relied on that exact societal guilt to keep me securely trapped in my designated role as the perpetual family failure. They desperately needed me to stay broken so their fragile fake empires could appear tall by comparison. But the truth is that toxic biology is just an accident of birth. Real family is not defined by shared DNA or a common last name. Real family is the person standing right beside you, holding your hand, when the entire world is actively trying to crush your spirit. Declan never once asked me to shrink myself to make others comfortable. He handed me the tools to build an impenetrable fortress and stood guard at the gate. We walked out of the towering glass lobby and stepped into the bright warmth of the Austin afternoon. The bustling city streets were filled with people chasing their own ambitious versions of the American dream. For a long time, I mistakenly thought my dream was simply to finally earn my mother's elusive approval. Now I understand that true independence is the absolute total rejection of a rigged game. The classic American ideal is heavily focused on building yourself up from nothing, but nobody warns you about the family members who will actively try to sabotage your foundation. Donovan tried to steal my life's work to artificially inflate his fragile ego. Vanessa tried to steal my dignity to mask her deep, pathetic insecurities. Brenda tried to steal my sanity just to maintain her shallow country club illusion. I had successfully broken a massive generational curse of financial abuse and narcissistic control. I did not just survive their highly coordinated attempts to destroy me. I aggressively dismantled the very foundation of their power and used the rubble to build something that would protect others from enduring the exact same nightmare. I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me as we walked toward our favorite outdoor cafe. The heavy, suffocating burden of my past was completely gone forever. I no longer flinched when my phone buzzed expecting a screaming demand. I no longer spent my holidays scrubbing heavy roasting pans while arrogant bullies openly mocked my career choices. The sprawling suburban estates and fake billionaire facades had all burned to the ground, leaving only the solid, unshakable truth behind. We took our seats at a small corner table under the shade of a large oak tree. Declan ordered our lunch and smiled across the table at me. His eyes held the same fierce pride they had the day he handed me the keys to our luxury penthouse. I looked at the vibrant, bustling city around me, feeling the absolute weight of my hard-fought freedom. I took a slow sip of my iced water and let the final lingering ghost of my past slip away into the summer breeze. I thought about the vicious extortion threats in the pantry and the humiliating laughter on the frosty driveway. They truly believed their cruelty was a highly effective weapon, but it was actually the direct catalyst for my total liberation. They told me I'd be nothing without their charity. They were right. Without them, I'm an $11 million CEO. And without me, they are just inmates and outcasts.